Welcome back after the break. You're watching Indus News and I'm Fiza Jamal with our main stories in detail. We start from Sudan, where after months of negotiations, the ruling military council and the civilian opposition coalition have agreed on a constitutional declaration. African Union mediator Mohammed Hassan Libat says the deal will pave the way for a 3-year transitional government. Details here.
The long-awaited deal on the constitutional declaration triggered celebrations across Sudan. African Union mediator Hassan Libat says the pact outlines the powers of a joint civilian military ruling body. It also dictates the deployment of security forces and immunity for generals over recent violence.
I am very happy to announce to the Sudanese people, the international and African people, that the two delegations have completely agreed on a constitutional declaration.
The power-sharing deal envisages a governing body of 6 civilians and 5 generals. Once the transitional government takes office, Sudan will undergo a 3-year transition leading to elections.
For more on this, we are joined by Dr. Margo Gabriel, who is an active member of Sudan's Doctors' Union in London. Thank you, Dr. Margo, for your time. So the military and protesters have reached several agreements which fell out one after another. Do you think that this deal would last?
Well, I would say no agreement has ever been reached between the protesters and the military junta. There have always been negotiations where they start till they continue again, then cease and so forth. I think there is an issue of trust between the protesters to the military. They see that they are, sitting on the negotiation tables, but still they're attacking civilians with the sheer force. The last massacre was on the 29th of July in Al Ubaid, where students, secondary school students, were shot dead when they went out peacefully protesting. So I think there is an issue. The only thing we say, what we can hope is that there will be an international observation and monitoring for this process to ensure and exert pressure on the council, on the military personnel, that they will not continue to come out of this agreement. The military, of course, now, or the military council will be dissolved, and it will be part of the Sovereign Council, which, as you mentioned in your report, will constitute of 6 civilians and 5 military personnel. So they will be part of the council. However, I can't deny that people are still very suspicious about the military council. I think we push them toward this signing the declaration, and the guarantee is by us continuing to monitor and ensure that there is a mobilization of the civil society institutions in Sudan, which was dismantled by the previous regime.
Yes, let's all hope for the best, and we will keep tabs on this developing story. Thank you, Dr. Margo Gabriel, for your time. Moving on, forces loyal to Commander Khalifa Haftar have killed 9 pro-government fighters in Libya. A military spokesman said 5 of them were killed in an airstrike south of Tripoli. The spokesman said a number of Haftar's fighters were killed in clashes while government soldiers retook control of key positions. Khalifa Haftar launched an offensive in April to wrest control of Tripoli from United Nations recognized government. Pro-GNA armed groups have weathered the initial onslaught, but over 1,000 people have been killed since then. Turkey says it has killed 6 more Kurdish militants during an ongoing counter-terrorism operation in northern Iraq. The National Defense Ministry says Turkish fighter jets bombed the Haftanian region as a part of Operation Claw. Turkey launched the operation against the Kurdistan Workers' Party, known as the PKK, in the Hakurk region of Iraq on May the 27th. Protesters in Algeria are marching through the capital, Algiers, warning of civil disobedience for the first time since demonstrations began in February. The marchers are demanding the resignation of Army Chief Ahmed Gaid Salah and Interim President Abdelkader Ben Salah. The months-long anti-government campaign in Algeria continues despite a heavy police presence. The deadlock between the authorities and the protest movement has hardened since the army rejected preconditions to talks earlier this week. Demonstrations began in February against the rule of ailing President Abdelaziz Bouteflika, who was forced to step down in April this year. 3 Taliban leaders have been killed in an airstrike in western Farah province. The Afghan Defense Ministry says the shadow Taliban governor for Farah, Mullah Abdul Bari, was among the dead. The ministry did not say whether the raid was carried out by the Afghan Air Force or NATO-led coalition forces. United Nations says over 1,500 civilians were killed or wounded in the Afghan conflict in July. A report by United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan says this is highest monthly toll so far in 2019 and worst single month since May 2017. United Nations says attacks by the Taliban and other anti-government groups have intensified the conflict. Meanwhile, talks between United States and Taliban have resumed in Doha amid hopes of a peace deal. A withdrawal of U.S. forces and a Taliban pledge to prevent terrorist attacks from Afghanistan have dominated the discussions. U.S. Special Envoy Zalmay Khalilzad says Taliban are signaling they would like to conclude an agreement. He says United States is ready for a peace deal, allowing it to withdraw forces from Afghanistan. Khalilzad says a U.S. troop withdrawal would depend on conditions in the battle-scarred country. And NATO says it has agreed on ways to deter Russia from deploying new medium-range nuclear missiles after the collapse of a Cold War treaty. Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg says NATO's response will be measured and only involve conventional weapons. Details in this report.
The collapse of the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty by the US and Russia has become a matter of serious concern for major world powers. NATO Chief Jens Stoltenberg says new Russian missiles can hit European cities within minutes.
Russia has deployed the SSC-8 missile system. The new Russian missiles are nuclear-capable, mobile, and hard to detect. They can reach European cities with only minutes of warning time.
Britain and Poland blame Russia for the treaty's collapse, but China criticized the US for leaving the accord. Its foreign ministry spokeswoman says the move shows Washington's ignorance of its international commitments.
The withdrawal is another negative move by the US to pursue unilateralism in disregard of its international commitments, aiming to shake off the bindings by itself and seek unilateral military and strategic advantages.
Germany has warned that Moscow and Washington's decision to scrap the treaty would have serious consequences for European security. Foreign Minister Heiko Maas says a failure to agree on rules for disarmament risks a new arms race.
United States has imposed a second round of sanctions on Russia over the alleged poisoning of a former spy, Sergei Skripal, in Britain last year. The new sanctions prevent Russia seeking financial assistance from the World Bank and the IMF. United Kingdom and United States accuse Moscow of attacking Skripal and his daughter with a nerve agent, but Russia denies its involvement in the crime. Moscow says the move will hurt already strained US-Russia ties. Washington imposed an initial batch of sanctions last year. The White House says new sanctions have been imposed because Russia failed to provide the assurances required under United States law. In another development, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has once again inspected the test firing of a newly developed rocket system. This comes a day after Seoul said Pyongyang fired at least 2 short-range projectiles into the Sea of Japan. North Korea has been testing missiles despite a June 30 meeting between US President Trump and Kim, where the two agreed to revive stalled talks. Downplaying the North Korean missile tests, President Trump said Kim will not want to disappoint him. The president said Kim has a beautiful vision for his country. 3 people have been killed and 2 more injured after a cliff collapsed at a popular Southern California beach. California's lifeguard department say the sandstone cliff collapsed at Grandview Beach in Encinitas, a suburb north of San Diego. The slice of rock fell 15 feet onto the beach and its people. The area is highly popular with local residents, surfers, and holidaymakers. Officials say a woman died at the scene, while 2 people died in the hospital. Thousands of protesters have gathered in Hong Kong for the 9th straight weekend amid rising tensions with the government. They rallied in the Mong Kok district before marching into the center to protest against a controversial extradition bill. Meanwhile, thousands have gathered to support Hong Kong's police at a separate rally in Causeway Bay. The pro-police protesters say they will continue to support the police and authorities to maintain the island's law and order. Protests for the past 2 months have grown increasingly violent as police protesters clashed several times. Norway says Venezuelan officials and opposition representatives have repeated their willingness to agree on a constitutional solution. The statement came after US President Trump said he is considering whether to impose a quarantine or blockade on Venezuela. Norway's foreign ministry says the 2 sides are continuing talks in Barbados to end Venezuela's political crisis. Opposition negotiator Stalin Gonzalez thanked Norway for its mediation. Meanwhile, President Nicolas Maduro rejected United States threats of a possible blockade. He says Venezuela's seas will remain free and independent. Maduro says he asked his United Nations ambassador to denounce the United States threats at the Security Council. He says United States takes harsh steps whenever a dialogue is in progress. And now we'll take a very short break, but don't go anywhere. Welcome back after the break. We'll move on to our next story. India's Supreme Court says mediation has failed to bring about a settlement in Ayodhya land dispute case. It has now ordered a series of day-to-day hearings which will commence on August the 6th. This report has more.
The destruction of the Mughal-era Babri Mosque in 1992 triggered one of the worst episodes of sectarian violence in India's post-partition history. 2,000 people died in the riots that followed. Hindu radicals claim the mosque stood on the birthplace of their god, King Rama. A land dispute over the contested holy site followed, fueling tensions between Hindus and Muslims.
We welcome whatever the Honorable Supreme Court has said in the matter of Babri Masjid Ayodhya case.
The Hindu Mahasabha's legal team has welcomed the Supreme Court's move.
Today, Supreme Court has said that we'll hear the matter on day-to-day basis from 6th of August. Supreme Court has further directed that suit number 3, which is of Nirmohi Akhada, and suit number 5, which is of Ramlala Virajman, will be taken up first. And that's a very good sign for all of us.
The development comes at a time of increased ethnic strife in the country. The rise of the BJP, led by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, coincided with increased anti-Muslim sentiment. Muslims make up 14% of India's population of 1.3 billion.
The President-elect of the European Commission has proposed a new pact on migration and asylum seekers. Ursula von der Leyen met Italian Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte in Italy. European Commission President Leyen and Prime Minister Conte discussed migration and overcoming political division. She said migration is inherent in a globalized world and it will not go away. Leyen said Europe needs a new kind of burden-sharing framework with countries like Italy, Greece, and Spain. These countries are geographically more open to migration.
Especially when it comes to burden sharing. Yes, indeed, I think we need a new kind of burden sharing. And I'm aware of the fact that countries like Italy, like Greece, like Spain are in an exposed geographical position.
Now let's go to Moscow, where the government has opened a shelter for migrants in the border city of Ciudad Juarez. The facility is meant to house Central American people waiting for their asylum claims to be processed by United States. More in this report.
The US has sent over 15,000 Central American people to Mexico since January. This means having to build shelters like the Leona Vicario Integral Center for Migrants. In June, Mexico made an agreement with Washington to cut the number of migrants traveling from Central America to the US.
What we are doing is fulfilling a promise signed between the governments of Mexico and the United States for a larger issue, which is to avoid any intention at that time of the so-called tariffs.
US asylum cases can take years to reach a conclusion. Large backlogs mean scheduling a simple hearing can take months.
Well, I walked to the United States, but no, they sent us back here to Mexico with no hope, with no place to stay, but rather out here on the street. They just sent us to the bus station, and that was it. And we're here for nothing, with no hope, because they don't have a shelter for us.
All this is taking place under a US policy called the Migration Protection Protocols. Human rights groups have condemned the program, saying it endangers migrants by putting them in some of Mexico's most violent cities. They say children are particularly at risk, especially to gang recruitment and sexual abuse.
Congo says it has lost track of an Ebola outbreak which has cost 1,800 lives over the last year. Chief Ebola researcher Jean-Jacques Mayembe says only 50% of Ebola cases are detected. He warned the current deadly outbreak could last up to 3 years. Mayembe says a man who died this week in the city of Goma, near the Rwandan border, has 10 children. He says the man may have infected an unknown number of people. Goma's first Ebola case was detected in mid-July. Since then, the World Health Organization has warned the spread of disease could accelerate. The death toll from a dengue outbreak in Bangladesh has risen to 44 in less than a month. A health department report says the mosquito-borne disease has infected over 21,000 people just this year. The report says over 1,600 new cases have been reported across the country. Since the year 2000, around 60,000 Bangladeshis have been diagnosed with the disease. More than 300 have died. Greenland's ice sheet has experienced its biggest summer melt, losing 12 billion tons of surface ice to the ocean in one day. This comes as the heat wave, which hit Europe last week, has reached the Arctic. The Danish Meteorological Institute says Greenland's melt season begins around the end of May. This year it began at the start of the month. The institute says the country's ice sheet lost 197 billion tons of ice in July alone. The melted ice sheet is equivalent to 80 million Olympic swimming pools. Scientists say this heat wave can trigger one of Greenland's biggest ice melts since 1950, when reliable records began. And it is 400 years since the first people were captured and sold into slavery in what is now called the Ivory Coast. The event has been marked by an ancient ceremony the slaves themselves would have experienced. This report has the details.
This is the same ceremony on the same spot, in the same river as the first slaves to leave Ivory Coast would have experienced 400 years ago. The rituals happen here on the River Bodo to ward off misfortune and purify the soul.
The slaves are brought from the north to the south, led say to the center towards the site. By the time they get here, they have crossed several rivers without stopping. But once here, this water stops them and is a way of saying Africans cannot be mistreated before this water. They must be unshackled, washed, so they may find themselves again.
It was meant to restore their health, protect them against harm, and remind them of their origins. Now, it also remembers the human beings sold and carried off to the coast, and then the Americas.
The slaves, the captives, arrived here. It was a place, a market. From here you can see behind us that there is the Nitsi River and the Bandama, which join up, and the Bandama from here is navigable. You don't have any rocks from this point and all the way to Babri, which is further away.
Ivory Coast is now commemorating the old slave route, while UNESCO has erected a monument to remember those people lost to the country forever.
President Donald Trump says rapper A$AP Rocky is on his way back to United States after being released from jail in Sweden. Earlier, a Swedish judge ordered the release of Rocky and his two friends until the verdict on assault charges are announced on August the 14th. The three men were detained on July the 3rd after a street brawl. In the world of business, Samsung Electronics has recorded a 56% drop in its second quarter operating profit. This comes after a continuous decline in memory chip prices amid an oversupply. The world's biggest smartphone maker recorded a $5.6 billion profit in the second quarter. The company says demand for smartphones has declined due to economic uncertainty. Last week, Samsung's chip rival SK Hynix said it would cut investment and production to shore up a nascent recovery in demand. Well, it's surprisingly pleasant today in Lahore, but let's see what the weather is looking like today around the globe. These are all the main stories in detail I have for you this hour. For further updates, stay tuned to Indus News.